Hello, my name is Sarah Howe. I am a poet and a trustee of the Griffin Foundation, speaking to you from London, England. It's my honour today to speak to Carl Phillips, whose prizes and honours are really too numerous to get into now, but include the Pulitzer Prize in 2020 for his New and Selected, Then the War. The most recent of his 17 books of poetry, Scattered Snows to the North, has been shortlisted for the 2025 International Griffin Poetry Prize. The judges said of the book, Phillips has found a way to articulate love in all its assertions and disguises. How grateful the reader is to enter and re-enter these poems, to be entered by them. Congratulations, Carl. I
Thank you.
wondered, could I invite you to set us going with a poem?
Sure, of course. It's an honor to be here and in conversation with you, Sarah. Thank you. This poem is called Stop Shaking. Not the bell, I said. One of us did. Not the bell, but the smaller sounds, barely noticeable, trapped inside it. It seemed the kind of thing I might say to remind myself, when I've forgotten again, what I want to believe even now matters most. Precision, though it's hard these days to know for sure what's true. Isn't every season, no matter what we call it, shadow season? Didn't Timothy used to mean a meadow, a common name, back then at least, for the sweetest grass? I keep making the same avoidable few mistakes that I've always made, and then regretting them, and then regretting them less. Think of all the suffering happening everywhere, all the time, for nothing. What if memory's just the dead, flourishing differently from how they flourished alive?
Thank you. That was absolutely beautiful. We've not met before today, but I heard you read for the first time this winter past in the Royal Festival Hall in London, and
Oh,
I
wow.
found the your set was absolutely magical, magnetizing. The quiet intimacy of it, even in a hall of 2,000 people. I wonder how important is the reading aloud of poems to you, Carl?
That's a very good question. Um, well, it's very important to me in the making of poems. Uh, I'm very, I guess I think maybe many other poets think this way too, but I think of building poems as a kind of musical scoring. So, I mean, there's the imagination part and getting something on the page, but then I'm really interested in how can there be a system with language that works in music where whoever plays a certain piece by Bach, it'll sound the same. And obviously there can be some modulations, but but the tune is intact. So I do a lot of reading out loud when getting poems revised to sort of see where's this pause, where can the line break as a certain kind of pause, but a comma versus a semicolon. To me, those are sort of like quarter notes versus half notes in music. And so it's important to me in that way. Um, all that goes out the window when I'm in a pavilion reading to thousands of people, and then I'm terrified, and I don't know why I thought it was important to read aloud at all. Yeah.
um, the poem you've just read for us, like many in this book, I suppose, is a sort of meditation on memory, but also on forgetting. That line
Mhm.
to remind myself when I've forgotten again. Memory emerges in this book as a sort of shifty creature and willful and potentially misleading. I was very struck by that image of the blades that come to winnow nostalgia from the truth and
Mm.
the sudden violence of that, which is quite shocking when it appears. So tell us about your negotiation with memory and its errors and evasions in this work.
Sure. You know, I'm realizing by far not the first person to have discovered this, but it was a new thing to me to suddenly realize, I don't know, maybe 5 years ago, that memory isn't reliable the way I assumed it was. And I know people figure that out as they get older. Um, but I kind of have always thought that memory is the way in which you can hold fast to the truth. And so if you remember it a certain way, that's how it happened. And as long as you don't forget, then that will be locked into place. And it's taken me a while to realize that we remember things differently, and the same people can be at the same party and have very different memories of what occurred. And uh, so that has made me sort of reconsider so many parts of my past, especially past relationships where, of course, it's easy to remember them a certain way that usually makes us look good. Um, and and to realize, well, maybe it wasn't that way. But I've also experienced some recent losses of people dying whom I've been involved with. And there's a strange thing, whether it's a partner in a relationship or someone just in one's regular sort of family, parents or something. It's odd when you realize you're the last one left who remembers something, um, because the other people in the party are dead. So it means, one, how can you be accurate? But also there's this huge responsibility to, if you're the last one holding this alive, how are you going to present it? It's almost as if you have the freedom to rewrite what happened because there's no one to contradict you. So anyway, it's made me realize what you've been saying. The memory is much more slippery than I thought and not reliable, um, and sometimes a distraction and sometimes a rescuing force at the same time, even a mismemory, because it can be saving to not remember the horrible truth about something and to get it sort of swaddled into something more palatable, I suppose. Um, but again, is it accurate? Is it precise? So I don't know, but yes, and I didn't know that when I was putting the poems together. I didn't know there was a theme about memory at all, but so it goes when you put a book together, as you know.
We learn so much about ourselves after it's
Hmm.
all done, don't we? Um,
Yeah.
I mean, there's so much in the book's title, isn't there? Scattered snows to the north. I sort of note in passing that it's a weather forecast, of
Hmm.
course, which in its own little way is an art of predicting the future, however modest.
Hmm.
I could ask you about so much in it, whether the weather or snow or the idea of north, but I'd like to probe that word scattered, actually, which I wonder, the classicist in you makes me think that Orpheus is maybe there in the background, his scattered limbs, maybe even Petrarch's scattered rhymes. Um,
Oh, wow.
but I feel like there is a sort of prismatic scattering at work in this book.
Hmm.
The way the section titles work, sort of refracting poems that appear elsewhere, makes me think I'm on the right lines, and that there's a tension here between scattering and coherence. Was that a principle you were working with as you put the book together?
Well, it's not, but it's fascinating what you're saying because let's see, this is one of those interviews where you suddenly find you're learning a lot about yourself, because it sounds accurate, and it's consistent with the idea of memory, I suppose, the idea of bringing bits together that are scattered across memory and trying to come up with a narrative of what happened. Um, but that did not occur to me, and I mean, one of the sometimes maybe tedious things about me is I'm extremely literal. And so I tend to think if it says scattered snows, that's what it means. But of course, snow has its resonances with death and something like James Joyce, or other places. And I agree about the scattering of limbs of Orpheus. And so there are these things. And snow, of course, age and moving into the north, where I always think north is death, even though I know west is supposed to be death where the sun
Mm.
sets, but somehow north seems there. Uh, so no, I'm not able to put a book together with an organizing principle from the start. It's one of those things where eventually I have what feels like a number of poems that if I put them together, I might see what happens, and I start to see links and connections. Um, but it hadn't occurred to me until you just spoke of it that this idea of scattering, even though it's in the title, would be at work. And it seems you're right. And I will say, with those section titles, it used to be until the very end, before I turned the manuscript in, each section, whatever the title was, ended with the poem with that title. And at the
I
last
see.
minute, I decided to switch them around so that no section title poem would appear in its actual section. And my idea at the time was that I it seemed to me I kept hearing these resonances between, like, there's a there's a basin of water in one poem and there's a basin of water somewhere else. And at first I thought these were redundancies and it troubled me.
Mm,
Then I thought, well, maybe they're echoes consistent with the idea of memory. And I
mm,
thought if I made the section titles work that way, there'd be this idea of, oh, I've seen this title before, but where? And then you'd realize, oh, or it forecasts what's going to appear later in the book. So you'll see a title of a poem, but you haven't yet reached the section that has that title. So that scattering was deliberate. Um, and I remember thinking at the time, no one will ever notice this, but I'll know it's there. So you've noticed it, and I think that's
I
great.
I also noticed the basins of water and the reflections, and actually, what a nice segue to my next question, which was going to be about water and what it is
Mhm,
about that element that so sort of has this tidal pull for your imagination in this book, like whether it's the shore or even the deep sea bed or the river that the lover
mhm.
feels a kinship for, or those stunning tears of the title poem that were wet yesterday and 2 millennia ago.
Well, I'm so impressed with how closely you've read these poems. Thank you. Um,
It's a book that
yeah, I mean,
demands it, Carl.
well, the the water. What is the importance of it to me? All I know is the main importance of it is to me. I grew up. I'm in Massachusetts now, and I grew up more or less here, and um, where the ocean is sort of a daily presence. I mean, even just going to the supermarket, you're going to encounter it just off in the distance. And then after I'd lived here for 20 years, I moved to Missouri in the middle of the country where I thought I was going to be teaching for 3 years. It was a visiting job, and it turned into 33 years. And it was a very good job. I liked it. But I did notice that water kept reappearing even more strongly the longer I lived in Missouri. And I think because I was sort of trying to will it to still be in existence because there was no sign of it in the Midwest, which is a little snobby on my part because, of course, there are large and beautiful lakes and rivers in the Midwest, but I didn't count those as real water compared to the Atlantic. So, so part of it is just the place that immediately I live in my head, and but I also think of water as an epic, the passageway to often to the underworld or passage unto death. And and I think this idea that water as a transitional space, and somewhere in there, even though I don't write about this sort of thing, the whole Middle Passage and American slavery history is tied in with that, I think. Because the other part, I say I grew up in Massachusetts, and I did from high school on, but before that, my father was in the Air Force, and we moved almost every year of my childhood. So I think that made for me a sort of desire to be very rooted in one kind of landscape, at least. And Massachusetts ended up being the one. But it's odd because the connection with water isn't to me about rootedness. It's about the
Mm.
opportunity to pass elsewhere and travel to other places. That felt like a rambling answer, but
No,
that's
it's a
my
beautiful
answer.
answer. Uh, and I suppose, what color is water? I'm sort of pursuing some fascinations I had with this book that I'd like now to ask you about color.
Yeah.
That maybe the fascination with color here began with the fall colors of the presiding season in this book, the
Mhm.
autumn. But there are lots of colors um, that are sort of gestured towards as if there's a sensory or even sensual vividness being activated, but not actually defined, like whether those colors of extinction of the opening poem regime, or
Mhm.
how brightness is and isn't a color exactly. And I wondered what hold that has for you, this idea. Color perception maybe pointing to a slipperiness in perception, or getting at the
Mhm.
experience of others, like your red is my red or not. But I think it's
Mhm.
maybe more than that too.
It, I would like to think it is, and yet I don't know if I have a sophisticated answer to it, except that I'm very I'm a very visual person, I suppose, but many people are. And my fear often in poems is that especially use the word blue way too much. But that's certainly, I've thought about this a little bit because in my very first book from 92, I have a poem called Blue, and
Mm.
it attaches the color to the blue of my mother's veins. First of all, it's a poem about my
I remember
biracial
the poem.
background. And so so there's the blue that is seen in the pallor of a white person, a mother figure. There's the sort of blue-black darkness of my father, who's African American. And so there's always been this sort of fascination with what is blue and how can you find yourself in there in some way? And sometimes I think maybe I'm still doing that, though it's maybe the blue of water or the blue of sky. Um, and so I don't know. I don't know what it means, except that I certainly spend a lot of time in the natural world, and I look a lot at things like fall colors, and I guess that's as much as I can say. Sorry, that wasn't better.
No, no, that I guess as another mixed race person, I did wonder if there might be a sort of quiet, covert thought about fluidity and definition at work
Mhm.
that in those moments in the poems. So even if it's not sort of very worked out or articulated, I sense that there's something of that there.
I think it's related, even though I've not really spent time thinking about it, because I do feel that a thing that comes up in my poems a lot is restlessness, and it often is about sexual restlessness, but I also think there's a restlessness to do with just where does one belong at all? As a body, um, with other bodies, but racially, sexually, um, and even maybe memory has ties into this because there's a restlessness with wanting to try to sort of place things and I think of memory as a way to hold something in place, but if memory itself has a restlessness to it and consistent with our own sort of how our brains work, then do we ever know ourselves, and do we ever come still? And also, does one want to come still? Sometimes I think that restlessness is necessary. It's sort of imagination seems to me about restlessness. Otherwise, we would just stagnate and stay with one idea. So, but yeah, when people have said, "Oh, are you political, or do you write about this or that?" I don't think I write as very often overtly about my racial background, but I certainly think it sort of informs everything, just from, as you know, just from childhood, when you're questioned constantly and sort of asked to explain yourself.
I absolutely loved the chapter of My Trader's Mystery where you talk about those things. But I wanted to end with a question that sort of took another one of your prose books as a launch pad, The Art of Daring. And you
Mm.
define early on daring as a willingness to risk going forward when we hardly know where we are. And I think
Mhm.
there's something really interesting about getting lost and the idea of lostness in these poems.
Yeah.
I was especially thinking of this at the end of the book with that last poem where you have this pair who might be lovers swimming
Mhm.
out to the dark ship that might or might not be there.
Mhm.
Um, and I wondered if this book ending on that note of sort of faith and risk, which we might call daring by your definition, is that a sort of hopeful place to end for you?
To me, it is. I intended it that way. I put it at the end because I thought, yes, it's sort of mixed hope because trusting with somebody else, deciding to put trust in someone else as you move into what neither of you knows, seems to me a kind of definition of what a relationship is, actually. If it's going to be an exciting relationship, that you're constantly moving forward into a future you don't know, um, and there's so much intimacy involved in trusting the strangeness, but also trusting the person you know that they'll still be with you if despite what you might encounter. Um, so that seems hopeful to me. But some people have said, "Oh, it seems as if they're swimming toward death,"
Mm.
and then to which I say, "Aren't we all actually?" It's just sort of we hope a sort of slow crawl there, but in some ways, I also liked the idea of going back to this epic, this idea of heroes who sort of set off into the unknown, and there's all this hope of what could be found, but there's also not talked about all the terribleness that is likely to also be encountered.
Mm.
So, so yeah, it's my version of hope. I thought it was nice, and I'm very happy that you have realized that the ship may or may not be there, because it's
It's
not
a sort of,
clear.
it's a
And
very tricky moment, isn't it? That's like
mhm,
thinking about what simile is. It's one of those sort of breaking the fourth wall. It's a really interesting moment. Like the world of the simile seems to bleed into the reality, or vice versa. I found it
right,
really striking.
which I sometimes think is like memory too. That when is memory real, and when is it something that has been created for us to prevent us from seeing what's real? Um, and I think of simile and metaphor as ways to, yes, they help us see a thing differently from what it immediately is, but sometimes they can distract us from seeing what a thing really is, and the distraction can be more inviting or pleasurable.
Which makes me think of epic again, and how a
Mhm.
heroic simile might sort of supplant in its vividness the actual scene in front of us of the heroes. That's so interesting. Thank you, Carl.
Sure. I mean, sometimes I think that if someone said, "What are the 2 books that most inform your work?" and I never thought of this till the second, I might say The Iliad and The Lord of the Rings. Of all
All
things,
right.
they may be the 2 things I've read the most in my life, and very different kinds of quests, but this idea of epic, and yeah, journeys, violence,
Yeah,
daring.
yeah. Gosh, I love both of those too. um, uh, Um, Thank you so much, Carl. That was absolutely fascinating. So,
You.
listeners at home, if you would like to hear Carl read alongside the other shortlisted poets in Toronto, the Griffin Prize readings are June 4th this year at the Koerner Hall and broadcast live around the world. And thank you, everyone, for listening. Thanks, Carl.
Thank you.